Welcome to the Killer Innovation Show, the longest continuously produced podcast in history. Each week, Phil McKinney brings you the insights and strategies to amplify your creativity and innovation skills. Here's your host, Phil McKinney.
Welcome. How are you doing this week? Hopefully you have had a great week working on your innovations, your ideas, those things that are going to change the world. We are still on the road heading back to Denver, but I wanted to get this show out. This plays off of the previous show where we talked about innovation adoption curves and why it is important. But today's show, I'm introducing a new concept that gets referred to as the hyper adoption of innovation. And what do I mean by hyper adoption? A hyper adoption of innovation is a propensity for adopting and adapting to innovation at a speed and scale that is unmatched. Not just innovators or early adopters when we talk about the innovation adoption curve. We're talking about a pace and a scale unheard of, where that curve gets jammed to the left. So this is one that's having a lot of discussions going around. A lot of economists are looking at it to understand more about how and why certain countries and certain societies have seen economic growth and impact from innovation unique to them and at a scale that other countries and other parts of the world have not seen. So that's what the topic of today's show is: hyper adoption of innovation. Is that a competitive advantage? That's today's topic. Before we hop into the episode, though, got a favor to ask: like, follow, and share. Like the show, give us a like over wherever you get your podcast on. Follow us on social media: Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, etc., etc. And then share with others. If there is somebody in your organization, somebody who you think would benefit from listening to this topic around innovation, send them the link. Go over to Killer Innovations, copy the link to the show, and send that over to them. I would greatly appreciate it. And with that, let's hop into today's show. Previously, we've talked about innovation adoption and the innovation adoption curve and why it is so important. Needing to understand what is that curve and how to move across the curve with your own innovations, and how do you get success? How do you get the next part of that curve? The people that are maybe not the ones early in adopting new things, but those that will embrace it. You have to work your way across that innovation adoption curve. We've talked about that in the previous show. But let's talk about innovation adoption, your adoption and use of innovation as a competitive advantage. Now, whether that's you as an individual, as a consumer, your family, or your role within your organization, or if you're a leader of an organization, what is your posture? What is your willingness to adopt new innovations? The first question you need to ask yourself is, what type of an innovation adopter are you? Are you an innovator, an early adopter, early majority, late majority, or a laggard? Now remember, the innovators, they're out there on the bleeding edge. The early adopters are on the leading edge. They're going to be ahead of everybody else, but not be really the first ones. Then the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. So what type of an innovation adopter are you? Now, one of the most common terms I hear in the industries around that I've been involved in over my entire career is, we are a fast follower. We don't want to be the first ones, but we'll be right behind. That tells me that you are really a early majority. You're not an early adopter. Fast followers are not typically early adopters. You're waiting until it's proven successful. You don't want that downside risk. So let's just be honest. What type of innovation adopter are you? And you can answer that, you as a consumer, you as an employee within your organization, you as a leader within your organization. What type of innovation adopter are you? Now, there's a new category of innovation adopters. This is one that's been getting some more recent traction, and that is those teams, individuals, and entire societies that have moved into what is referred to now as hyper adoption of innovation. Hyper adoption. Now, what do I mean by hyper adoption of innovation? This is the propensity of adopting and adapting to innovation at a speed and scale that is unmatched. These are people that are just will take anything and everything coming at them. They're willing to change. They're willing to embrace that change. They're willing to drop how they used to do it and move quickly to new things, new approaches, new policies, new processes. This hyper adoption of innovation. Now, what's an example of this hyper adoption? Well, the best example of this is to look at the impact of hyper adoption on the economies of some countries that have been able to shift their society to be hyper adopters. And this will give you a little bit of insight on the kinds of competitive advantage that can be created if you transform your organization to be hyper adopters, or you as an individual shift to being hyper adopters. Now, what I'm not saying is just adopt anything and everything. Just go, 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 go. You have to have some kind of a criteria. But in the areas for you, your personal career, your personal objectives, or your organizational objectives, or societal objectives, innovations that can have that impact, you don't want to be that, quote, fast follower. You don't want to be in that early majority. You can create out of the norm, beyond anything that the typical criteria of success. You can create yourself an unfair competitive advantage by looking at hyper adoption. So that's what we're going to talk about. Now, what I'm going to talk about with regards to using these countries, specifically China and India, as two examples. This is based on a recent Harvard Business Review article by Zach Deichwald. So this is an article that just came out May, June of 21. We will have a link to the article in the show notes. But this is the article that kind of got me thinking with regards to this role of hyper adoption. Those people, those individuals, those organizations, those countries that just operate at a pace of adoption that is beyond scale, at a pace that's just nobody's ever seen before. So let's talk specifically around the global rise of Chinese companies. Now, we've seen the Chinese companies that 10 years ago, 20 years ago were, just starting to grow, but we've seen this absolute explosive growth. And now China has at its disposal a resource that no other country has. A vast population, not a niche population, but a vast population that has lived through unprecedented amount of change. And consequently, they've developed a propensity for adopting and adapting to innovations at this speed that is just never been seen before. So how does this look? Well, one is that this China's innovation ecosystem, it's hundreds of millions of the hyper adaptive consumers that make China so globally competitive today. In the end, innovations must be judged by the people's willingness to use them. And on that front, China has no peer. You can't force people to change. You change the perception of society. In the case of the Chinese people, they are willing to change. They know change is good, and they're willing to take on and change as they need it, at the pace they've needed to do that. Now, one way to look at this is what we call the lived experience. Lived experience is the change that people have lived through their lives. Now, the lived experience has shaped China's unique attitude towards adoption. Think about it, about how much China has changed. If you look at lifetime per capita GDP to track how much economic change people have lived through, right? So if you just think about the GDP growth, right? The U.S. per capita GDP growth has grown roughly 2.7 times from 1990. 2.7 times, which sounds pretty impressive. You're north of 2%. Until you realize that somebody born in China in 1990 has seen their per capita GDP grow by 32 times. The U.S. GDP growth, 2.7 times. China's GDP growth, 32 times, a whole order of magnitude greater. In 1990, China's GDP represented less than 2% of the global total. By 2019, that share jumped to nearly 19%. Now, this is this hyper-adoption and hyper-adaptive, being able to change, being able to adapt what's going on around them. You can't do this just through the process of the increments. You cannot get to this kind of growth in response to the normal adoption curve, where you've got innovators and early adopters and early majority. By the time you transition that, the hyper adoption organization, the hyper adoption countries and societies will just blow right past you. So hyper adoption is critical to understand, and thinking about it in the context of your own strategies, of your own organization. And this has been a relatively new concept. People have been trying to discern or understand why there have been so much change with regards to China, but also others such as India. So let's consider some of the specifics. In just the 3 years from 2011 to 2013, China poured more concrete than the United States had poured in the entire 20th century. Get that right. Just in 3 years, from 2011 to 2013, China poured more concrete than the United States had poured in the entire 20th century. In 1990, China's rural population had one refrigerator per 100 households. Today, that number is 96 per 100. In 1990, China only had 5.5 million cars on the road. Today, it has 270 million. They went from 5.5 million cars to 270 million, of which 3.4 million are electric, representing 47% of the global electric car fleet. And in 1990, 3/4 of the country's population was rural. Today, nearly 2/3 is urban, an increase of more than 500 million people. Change, adapting, adopting. Now, the Live Changed Index, so this is this whole concept of how much change have people been living. And there's this hypothesis that's out there that says that if someone has lived through a lot of change, then they're more willing to move into being a hyper adopter, hyper adaptive to this change. So during the past 3 decades, per capita GDP, let's talk about India, has grown in roughly a linear fashion from just over $350 to more than $2,000. Huge growth. Whereas in China, it has grown almost exponentially, not linearly, exponentially, from just under 350 to more than 10,000. That disparity helps explain why so many Chinese will try new things. They'll scan a QR code, whereas many people in India will not. The point here is not to say that any one culture is better at innovation, but rather than certain development ecosystems create naturally different perspectives, different attitudes, different willingness to try new things, an attitude towards change, newness. More than any other population in the world, the Chinese in recent years have had to adapt to radical change. And they have learned that innovation technologies can be the key to their survival. Absolutely key. So to compete successfully with China in the decades ahead, countries and companies will need to start to strategically prioritize not just your innovation input. What do you use the innovations for? In the form of, imagined new tools and technologies, but also on innovation output that becomes transformational through rapid adoption on a very large scale. How do you launch your innovations to drive hyper adoption? That is going to be key. And if you crack that code, both in the hyper adoption yourself, but thinking differently about how your innovations can be hyper adoptive by others, you will create an unfair competitive advantage for yourself and for your organization. Now, in the short term, China has a clear advantage in terms of output thanks to its huge population of hyper adopters and hyper adapters. And as a result, it is poised to take the lead in the innovations arms race. But there is no declared winner yet. There's no declared winner. Just because you are in the United States or you live in Western Europe or Canada, Australia, China, India, wherever you live, every country, every region still has an opportunity to be a winner in this innovation arms race. The key is how do you think about it? How do you change? How do you change not just yourself, but your organization, your means of education within the country you live in, changing your government, changing societal norms, changing people's willingness to embrace change, to hyper adapt and hyper adopt. So the question is how do you become a hyper adopter? How do you become a hyper adopter of innovation? Your call. There's lots of ways to do this. This thinking is still relatively new. So you are, in effect, by listening today, somewhat on this leading edge of this concept. But don't overlook the advantages of being a hyper adopter just in yourself as a starting point. Be open to try new things. Try new things. Be willing to change yourself. Change is one of those funny things, right? When I teach workshops or engage with teams or I'm coaching, mentoring executives, the one comment, the question I ask is, are you and your organization, willing to change? Is change something that your organization is comfortable doing? Like, oh yeah, we're ready. We know we have to change, blah, 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 blah. But when you get down to personal one-on-one conversations and you ask about, are you willing to change? The attitude more likely is, yeah, we need to change. I'm fine, but Joe over there needs to change. If Joe would change, we'd be great. I'm fine. I'm doing all the right stuff. But Joe over there, he needs to change. And if he changed, we're golden. That is not embracing change. That's basically saying everybody needs to adapt to you. That is not hyper adaptation. That is not what we're talking about here. You need to be willing to change. Everybody in your organization needs to be willing to change. And look, even in, with your significant others, your relationships, are you willing to change? You need to be willing to change. And not waiting until it's forced. Not waiting until, someone's gonna pry that old BlackBerry out of your fingers. You're gonna hold on to that because you don't want to go to a smartphone. Or you're gonna, have a certain kind of vehicle or a way you run meetings, or as a leader, as a manager, your philosophy on remote work versus requiring people to be in the office. Are you willing to change? Are you willing to adapt and adopt? But not just adapt and adopt. Do it at hyper scale. Doing it at hyper speed. That is what is required. If you are going to create an unfair advantage, a uniquely competitive position relative to your competitors, and in the effect of you yourself and your own career success and societal impact, is this concept of hyper adoption. That is the pace of adopting new things and the willingness to change how you do things. If you think about even what's happened in China with mobile payment, with the willingness of everybody to go do fully digital banking, you'd be shocked at how few people in the United States are doing digital banking. But you go outside of the U.S. and you look at mobile banking, it is by far the norm. When I'm in Rwanda, everybody banks by phone. Nobody goes to a bank. Everybody is doing 100% of their transactions. Why? Because they didn't have another option early on. There was nothing to hold on to in the past. They're willing to adapt and adopt. And those are the ones we have to keep an eye on, because they will innovate at a pace that will smoke you. It will leave you in the dust. The pace of innovation, we talk about this many times, the pace of innovation is accelerating. And that is driven primarily by this hyper adoption. This hyper adoption of speed and the hyper adoption of scale. Speed not just being the early adopters or the innovators, but the pace of adoption, the sheer number, the sheer speed, the rapid way in which something new just becomes the new normal within society. Now, I'm going to give you a little hint about a future show. At some point, we'll talk about this. And that is you have to be conscious of hyper abandonment. With hyper adoption, people will shift from doing something with product A and they'll shift to product B very, very quickly. And they will abandon product A. So while there's hyper adoption, there is also hyper abandonment. Quickly dropping what is used today to move on to the next thing. This creates the effect of always needing to innovate, always needing to bring out the new thing, not just the new feature, but even innovate. Innovate and destroy your own core business, because if you don't come up with that innovation, the person who can come up with a hyper adopted innovation will put you out of business. It will absolutely wipe you out. But we're not going to talk about that today. That's just a little teaser. We will talk about hyper abandonment in a future show as we dig in more into this hyper adoption, not just innovation adoption on a normal scale, but hyper adoption. So keep that noodle on that. Think about that. Think about your own examples of technologies that you may use. Think about what you can do as an individual to move into this hyper adoption, adopting new things faster, quicker, both yourself, your family, but also your organization. But be strategic. Don't be random. Be strategic. If you are strategic and fast, strategic with hyper adoption, you can create this unique competitive advantage that will give you a level of success that your competitors could only wish for. So this week, one of the tasks I'd like for you to consider is thinking about how your innovations, the ones you're working on, how could you shift those into hyper adoption? How would you drive a scale and a pace that gives you unique competitive advantage? Step 2, think about your own adoption of innovation. You as an individual, as a consumer, but also your organization. And would being a hyper adopter of innovation, meaning you're on that front edge and you're bringing these innovations and getting the advantage of these innovations to operate at a pace and scale. It's the innovation input and the innovation output, the hyper innovation input, the hyper innovation output. So think about that this week. That's an area that I think you would get huge benefit from just carving out some time and thinking about that this week. With that, as we wrap up today's show, I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here with me today. I do greatly appreciate it. Time is a hugely valuable asset. None of us have enough of it, and your choice to take that valuable asset and invest it by spending time with me, I do greatly appreciate that. Can you help me pay it forward? We started this podcast 17 years ago in response to Bob Davis, my early mentor. When I asked Bob how I could pay him back, he laughed. He goes, you can't pay me back. You have to pay it forward. And that's what started the podcast 17 years ago. We are the longest continuously produced podcast in history. And we have every intention to keep doing this for as long as we can. But the way for you to help me pay it forward is by helping me pay it forward to more people. Tell others about the show, share it, like it, give us a comment, give us a rating wherever you get your podcast, over on iTunes or Google Podcast, or over on iHeart or Spotify, or wherever it is you have listened to this. Give us a rating. Let us know, let others know about the podcast. I would greatly appreciate it. And with that, let's wrap up this week's show. Have a great week. Continue to work on the innovation. Do not let the innovation antibodies get you down. The ideas and innovations you're working on can change the world, make the world a better place. With that, we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.
Podcasting nonstop since 2005, this has been the Killer Innovation Show on the Innovators Network.